So good afternoon. I can see we have a very small crowd here. No interest in this topic whatsoever. I'd just like to say what a pleasure it is for us to welcome Heather back to CSIS. We've been trying to arrange this for quite some time now, and even though we have almost constant communication on some issues, it's hard to get folks from the White House to come and speak publicly just because their schedules are so difficult. One of the things we did talk about, though, was since the president mentioned energy and climate change, both in the inaugural address and also in the State of the Union, fleshing out the details is something we were extremely interested in. I can't imagine that the rest of you don't have the same interest. So she was gracious enough to say that, well, I will come and do a public session for you, take some questions, give some prepared remarks, but then at least maybe we can exchange in a dialogue. And one of the things that we love about Heather is that we've done brown bag kind of roundtable discussions with her as well. Always found her to be candid and open and approachable. And that's the best you can do when the energy landscape is changing so rapidly, and collaboration between the industry and the government now is pivotal. So without further ado, let me introduce Heather Zichel, Deputy Assistant to the President, and she will put the meat on the bones, so to speak. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that introduction, Frank, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I can't think of a more appropriate place to talk about America's energy future than here at CSIS, which for more than 50 years has been a powerhouse of innovative thinking. And we need that now because energy still poses complex challenges. How do we seize the opportunity to be energy independent without jeopardizing our climate, air, lands, and water? How should we leverage the resources of the government and the private sector to make the greatest impact? In a time when our energy landscape is being recast, these are the kinds of questions that need attention. But let me start by saying this. Energy matters to the United States and its future for three central reasons. First, energy is the lifeblood of our economy. For that reason, the United States has an interest in ensuring that we have and will continue to have in the future access to energy that is safe, reliable, and affordable. Second, energy is fundamentally linked to our security both at home and abroad. And therefore, we have an interest in diversifying our energy supply and producing more of it within our own borders. Finally, how we develop, manage, and deploy energy in the 21st century will be critical in our efforts to address climate change, which is one of the clearest and most urgent challenges of our time. So the United States has not only an interest in transitioning to more sustainable sources of energy, we have an imperative. So energy is the common thread that links these three issues, our economy, our security, and our climate, and that's what I'd like to discuss with you today. First, I want to take a moment to set the stage and talk briefly about what's been happening in the United States over these past few years. Not too long ago, this story was told about America's energy future, and it wasn't all that optimistic. It was one of ever-declining domestic energy production and ever-growing energy dependence. But the story has been rewritten and old assumptions cast aside, because the United States is going through a period of profound change in the ways that it produces and consumes energy. Today, domestic oil production is surging and oil imports are falling to the lowest level in decades. Because of recent advances in technology, the United States is the world's leading producer of natural gas. Thanks to new fuel economy standards, we've doubled the distance our cars and trucks will go on a gallon of gas, saving consumers thousands of dollars at the pump. We've also doubled our use of renewable energy like wind and solar, and finally our emissions of carbon pollution have actually fallen over the last few years, even as our economy has continued to recover from the recession. After our first term, we are, for the first time in a very long time, moving towards a cleaner and more secure energy future. Now, we also recognize that the progress we've made is no reason or excuse for complacency moving forward, because even as we take advantage of new opportunities, we still face some familiar challenges. The United States remains vulnerable to disruptions in the global energy supply, even as we develop more oil and gas at home. We still waste too much of the energy we produce, which comes at a cost to consumers and the economy as a whole. Our leadership position in the global clean energy race is not guaranteed unless we do more to support American manufacturing and establish smart and stable tax policies. And we can choose to accept more frequent and more intense heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and floods as the new normal, or for the sake of our economy, our environment, and future generations, we can take decisive action to combat climate change. Earlier this month in his State of the Union, you heard President Obama speak directly to some of these challenges. and make clear his priorities for energy and climate policy in the second term. But that was just the beginning of the conversation, and in the weeks and months ahead, you'll hear more from the president as he makes the case for new action on these issues. That case begins with the economy. As the president has said, our top priority must be to do everything we can to grow the economy and create quality middle-class jobs. Energy is essential to those goals because energy can be a powerful engine of economic growth. Right now, for example, 7 of the 10 states that produce the most energy, including both fossil fuels and renewables, have unemployment rates lower than the national average. And then there are impacts to the economy as a whole. Right now, the abundance of affordable natural gas is supporting a new dawn in American manufacturing. The fact that natural gas prices in the United States are the lowest in the world makes America a much more attractive place to do business. And we're beginning to see a variety of companies from Dow to Ford Motors and others bringing manufacturing back to the United States. After shedding jobs for more than 10 years, our manufacturers have added about 500,000 jobs over the past 3. Now, when it comes to oil and gas, our focus is promoting safe and responsible development. Because even as we take steps to encourage production, we all have an interest in making sure it's done right. The administration will finalize common sense new rules requiring companies to disclose chemicals used in fracking operations on public lands, as well as tougher standards for well integrity and wastewater management. Those of you who follow these standards know they have been a source of conflict between industry and environmental groups. Let me say 2 things about that. First, we take very seriously our responsibility to protect public lands for future generations. And second, it's time to set old fights aside and try to work together. For many reasons, these proposed standards should be a win-win. We're not glossing over the challenges of natural gas development, but we're also not ignoring the opportunity natural gas presents for jobs and for the climate. In addition to oil and gas, we have a tremendous economic opportunity with clean energy. In his first term, President Obama made the largest investment in clean energy in our history. That investment supported nearly 50,000 clean energy jobs and 50,000 clean energy projects and tens of thousands of American jobs. Some states across the country are now getting upwards of 10, 15, or even 20% of their electricity from renewable sources. And last year, the wind and solar industries both had their best year in the United States. So we are beginning to claim the promise of clean energy. You can see it happening in big cities and small towns across the country. Last summer, I had the opportunity to visit a wind manufacturing facility in my home state of Iowa, owned by a company called Acciona Wind Power. When that plant first opened, all of the component parts used to assemble turbines were imported from overseas. Today, they source 80% of the components from North American suppliers, many of them from Iowa. This would not have been possible just a few short years ago, but it demonstrates the rapid progress that we've made to bolster clean energy manufacturing in the United States. And to help create more stories like that one, the president has set a new goal to double renewable power again from wind, solar, and geothermal sources by the end of the decade. It's an ambitious yet achievable goal. And in order to meet our target, we need Congress to step up. We need to create more certainty in the tax code instead of perpetuating the cycle of 1-year and 2-year policies that hinders stable long-term growth. We can't afford that approach, especially in a time when when other countries are going all in on clean energy. That's why the president supports making the renewable energy production tax credit permanent and refundable. Now, as important as energy is to our economy, it's critical to our security. And by some measures, we've made historic progress in this regard. From the time President Obama first stepped in the Oval Office to the time he took the oath of office once again, the United States reduced its oil imports by more than 3.5 million barrels a day. No other administration in history has reduced our dependence on oil more in a single term. And that means not only that we have greater energy security, but also that more of the money we used to send overseas is now staying here, being invested here, and creating jobs here. But as rising gas prices remind us, we are still too reliant on oil, which comes at a cost to our national security and to American families trying to make ends meet. And every year as prices rise, this sets into motion a spirited but ultimately predictable debate in Washington. There's no doubt we will soon hear from some who claim that we could solve all of our problems with high gas prices if the administration would just make a decision to drill more here at home. Of course, that misses the fact that oil development has actually increased every year President Obama has been in office. The oil output is at a 15-year high, and that we are on track to overtake Saudi Arabia as the largest oil producer in the world by 2020. More fundamentally, though, the problem with the drill everywhere argument boils down to this. Even when Americans are using oil produced entirely within the United States, the price of that oil is still determined by the global market. So instead of fighting about the things we can't control, let's focus our efforts on the things that we can. Take the administration's new fuel economy standards. By bringing together all of the major automakers, but also consumer and environmental groups, Democrats and Republicans, the president negotiated the toughest fuel economy standards in U.S. history. These standards will save family thousands at the pump and double the efficiency of our cars and trucks by the middle of the next decade. But those standards are already paying off. Last month, the average fuel economy of new cars sold in the United States reached an all-time high. But ultimately, to spare American families and businesses from painful spikes in gas prices, we need to shift our cars and trucks off of oil. And in the process, we can reach for another goal, making the United States the world's leader in transportation technology. That's why the president has proposed an energy security trust, which would focus exclusively on those goals. So the big question, how would it work? We propose using some of the revenues generated from oil and gas development, specifically $2 billion over 10 years, to fund research into a range of cost-effective technologies like advanced batteries, homegrown biofuels, and natural gas. Funding for the Energy Security Trust would be stable and guaranteed, and therefore help spark innovation and breakthroughs in technologies that have the greatest potential to displace oil in transportation and advance energy security. Now, the policies I've mentioned so far make sense for the economy and our security, but many also have the added benefit of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that brings me to the topic of climate change. Let me start by saying this. The central challenge we face when it comes to climate change isn't a typical one. We already have clean and affordable energy technologies. We already know policies that will make those clean energy sources flourish like never before. And we already know the steps we can and must take to help our cities and communities prepare for a changing climate. Instead, the challenge in addressing climate change is that it requires us to think not only about the here and the now, but also to look out into the horizon, 5, 10, 50 years from now, and decide what kind of planet we want to leave behind for future generations. Climate change isn't merely a future threat. The United States is already facing the consequences of a changing climate, and the evidence is all around us. Last year was the hottest year in the United States, and 12 of the warmest years on record have all come in the last 15. In 2012, we experienced 11 extreme weather events that caused at least $1 billion in damages. The price tag of Hurricane Sandy alone could exceed $50 billion. And the historic drought we endured last summer, which gripped more than half of the nation at its peak, landed a punishing blow to our nation's farmers and the crops they grow. We ignore these things at our own peril. That's why you heard the president make what was the most assertive case for action on climate ever heard in a State of the Union address. And we hope that Congress will act soon with a bipartisan, market-based solution to climate change. But the president also drew a clear line in the sand. If Congress won't act, he's prepared to. He will direct his cabinet to identify new executive actions we can take that will reduce carbon pollution, make our cities more resilient, and accelerate the transition to more sustainable sources of energy. So from our vantage point following the State of the Union address, the president's expectations of Congress couldn't be clearer, and now it's ultimately up to them to choose which path we take. I also want to make clear that a response to climate change can't be a Washington-centric solution. One of our priorities moving forward will be to engage with state and local officials, as well as leaders in the private sector, so that we can leverage our collective resources to keep moving forward. Let me give you an example. In the State of the Union, the president set a bold goal to double American energy productivity by 2030. To help us get there, we're launching an energy efficiency race to the top challenge. And with a $200 million investment in the president's budget, we will support states that adopt forward-leaning policies to cut energy waste. At the same time, we intend to build on the success of existing partnerships with the business community, like the President's Better Buildings Challenge. Just last week, we had a new batch of companies join this effort, including Macy's, Sprint, and Johnson Controls. Together, they will upgrade more than 200 million square feet of building space, which is roughly 70 Empire State Buildings. Of course, given that climate change is a global problem, it requires global action. In the past 4 years, the administration has led efforts in international climate negotiations that have produced a number of successes. The first set of national greenhouse gas reduction commitments by all major developed and developing countries, the most robust transparency system to date, and historic efforts in support of climate resiliency. In his second term, President Obama will continue to advocate for global action and at the same time advance policies here at home that support our goals abroad. I'd like to close with one last observation before we have some minutes to engage in Q&A. Given all of the progress we've made over the last 4 years, our biggest challenge today may be doing what's necessary to sustain our momentum and protect our gains. That's being tested right now, because in a few days, Congress might allow a series of immediate, painful, and arbitrary budget cuts to take place, known here in Washington as a sequester. It would gut vital investments in things like education, national security, and life-saving medical research, but also energy and the environment. Now, the impact of this policy won't be felt overnight, but it will be real. Development of oil and gas in federal lands and waters would slow down. Every state across the country would lose critical funding to ensure clean water and air quality monitoring, and funding from the Department of Energy that helps low-income families make their homes more energy efficient would be slashed. These cuts are wrong. They're not smart. They're nothing but a self-inflicted wound that doesn't have to happen. What we do need is a sensible, balanced plan, and that's exactly what President Obama has put forward. So if there's one message I want to leave with you today, it's this. After decades of talking about it, hoping for it, reaching for it, the United States is finally poised to control its energy future, but only if we accept our collective responsibilities. All of us have a role to play: elected officials, the private sector, thought leaders, NGOs, scientists, and engineers. Let's recognize the unique moment we're in and the clear opportunities in front of us. Instead of throwing up roadblocks for ourselves, let's make smart choices and plan for the future. If we can do those things, I'm confident we can build the energy future we all want with lasting benefits to our economy, our security, and our climate. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. So we only have, actually we have three. I was going to say we have two simple rules here when we do Q&A, but in a room this size, we have three. The three are: wait for the microphone after you're acknowledged, identify yourself, and to the extent you can, pose your question in the form of a question, and that doesn't mean just 15 minutes of commentary with an inflection. And Dana already has his hand up. So I think we'll just proceed to the questions. I will tell you that we have a kind of a hard stop around 3 o'clock, and that's one of the reasons we can get folks like Heather to come here, because we observe that. So, but for the next 25 minutes or so, happy to engage in those questions, and we'll start with Dana.
Thank you. Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group, American University. Thank you very much for those comments. I wonder, Heather, if I could draw you out a little bit on a point you made a few times, and of course the President made it very clearly in the State of the Union, on resiliency, adaptation. I think the term he used in the State of the Union was making communities more, be able to better adapt to the consequences of climate change. I wonder if you could discuss that, and also perhaps, is there a linkage between that and the President's long-desired goal of an infrastructure bank? Could those be somehow connected?
Thank you for your question, Dan. Taking a big step back, I mean, as the administration thinks about the climate challenge, we think about obviously the mitigation side of the challenge, as well as the adaptation side of the challenge. On the President spoke directly to the need to ensure that we are bringing resources to states and local communities, but that we are building on best practices, and we are using resources across the federal government to help communities, states, and local governments plan for the future. I think one of the areas, and Secretary Donovan, I think, deserves a lot of credit for the important work that he's been doing post Sandy to look at and ensure that as we are spending money to rebuild our communities, that we're not throwing good money after bad, and that we're thinking strategically about where we build and how we build. And we're doing that informed by some of the best thinking across the federal government, whether that's FEMA and the work that they're doing with the flood maps, or the work that the Department of Interior is feeding into the process. I think the lessons that we're applying there, I think ultimately we want to transfer and create sort of a playbook for the future. And I think part of the challenge around resiliency, frankly, is just trying to get a handle on what is it that the communities actually need and how can the federal government be responsive. So, I think that there's great opportunity around Sandy. I think there's additional work that we are working additional work across the federal government to identify resources, identify steps that we can help to support communities. And to your point about, infrastructure, I think, there's great opportunity to link that. It's certainly something that we have been looking at within the administration. And I think you can expect to hear more in the future on that.
David?
Thank you. David Goldwyn, Goldwyn Global Strategies in Brookings. Thanks for your comments today. I wonder if you could comment on how energy exports, LNG, products, even crude oil, play into the president's economic goals, sustaining production and national security goals, helping allies, and even climate goals.
The administration is trying to get, wrap its head around. I think Congress is also doing that as well. As a general rule, I think we are looking at this as an opportunity for the United States to create jobs, but we want to make sure that as we are looking at decisions where the federal government has jurisdiction, because in some instances we actually don't, that we are making those decisions based on what's in the best interest of the American consumer, but also doing that through the lens of how does this play into the energy security issues that you mentioned. On LNG specifically, I think folks in this room are probably aware of the fact that the DOE just wrapped up its public comment period. They will be in a position now to review those comments and ultimately make some decisions about the pending applications. So certainly expect to hear more from the Department of Energy on LNG specifically. And I think as a general rule of thumb for many people in this room, we are not opposed to the notion of exports. But again, I think that's through the lens of, making sure we are not doing that in a manner that's going to undermine American consumers.
Can I just follow that up? So it just struck me, so those of us that have been around this issue for a while, for the last 40 years, it seems like on oil and gas, our policy's been based on resource scarcity on the one side and then growing demand. And at least on the oil side, we have flipped that, right? So we got flat or declining demand and an enormous resource base. But a lot of the statutory requirements, even going back to, David knows this, going back to the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, there's inherent biases built in the law because we thought we were a scarce nation.
Right.
So is there a review underway to look at legislative, statutory, or regulatory provisions that may need to be tweaked or overhauled? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think the review, we're certainly doing our own review, and Congress, as you probably have read, is doing their own review and coming to their own opinions about where we should have tweaks to the existing law. But the short answer is yes, and, your point is spot on, which is a lot of the laws and the frameworks that we are working under today were developed decades ago, and we're very lucky that we are in this position, but we're also trying to make decisions in some instances with sort of an outdated regulatory framework. So certainly that's an area that, as an administration, we have been spending time looking at and assessing.
Makes it a little bit more tricky. Right? Sure. Front row. Thanks.
Charles Newstead from the State Department. Since I see you've once worked for Congressman Rush Holt and the New Jersey delegation, I'm sure you'll be familiar with the fusion lab up there in Princeton. And this is a little more general question. I wonder how you see the prospects for fusion energy and what the plans of the administration, if they have any, are for this rather long wage possibility.
Thank you for your question. It is very true that I worked for Rush Holt and was very lucky to learn from him directly about the important opportunities that fusion energy provides. I will, in terms of the specifics about what is the timeline and what exactly is that opportunity, I would refer you to my friend and colleague, Dr. Holdren at OSTP. But what I will say is that as an administration, when we think about the energy challenge, it is when the president talks about an all of the above approach. I think it's through the recognition that we can't put all of our eggs in one basket. As great as the natural gas revolution is, we can't do that at the expense of renewables. As great as wind is, we also need to continue to invest in improving solar. So, I think we are trying to pursue an all of the above approach. We're trying to continue to pursue an aggressive R&D agenda that looks at additional energy sources and new opportunities. And I think you'll see that in the president's budget reflected for FY14.
Lisa?
Thank you for doing this. I wanted to get back. I'm Suzanne Goldenberg from The Guardian. I wanted to get back to your point about if the president drew a line in the sand on this issue of climate action, and that if Congress didn't act, that he would. First, what's your time scale? Is it the current Congress, the lifespan of 2 years? And second, as you know, a number of environmental groups have put forward specific plans for reducing CO2 emissions from existing coal-fired power plants. I wanted to know whether that was a top priority for the administration as it takes this action, or indeed whether it's even under active consideration. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. I think in terms of the time scale, for as long as the president is in office, energy and climate policy is going to remain a priority, and would welcome an opportunity to engage in a thoughtful and constructive dialogue about how we move the needle here. And that could be something as broad-based as a clean energy standard, which you've heard the president call for in previous State of the Unions, or as small and focused on energy efficiency. I think the point is that we need to act, we need to put long-term policies in place, and the president stands ready to work and engage with Congress at any point in time. On your question, your broader question about EPA plans and existing sources, I think I have a couple things to say. I mean, the president, between the inaugural address and the State of the Union, made it very clear that climate change was going to be a priority in his second term. We have a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 17% by 2020. So I think sort of three key things are important. First and foremost, we can't put the cart before the horse. The EPA is working to finalize the standard on new coal-fired power plants. We received over 2 million comments on that proposal, and the agency is in the process of assessing those comments and working to finalize that. And I think what we've seen in the comments are both, one, strong public support, but also some thoughtful and creative suggestions from industries and other key stakeholders. So the EPA is going to spend its time focusing on the review process there and ultimately finalizing that rule. But I also think we have to remember here that even the standard on new coal-fired power plants is something that's never been done before and is going to shape the future of the power sector. So it's not an insignificant undertaking. Second, I would say it would be wrong, and certainly this isn't how the administration is thinking about it. I think it's wrong to fall into the trap that, one tool is going to get us the 17% target or get us all the way to where we need to be. These days in Washington, it's true that EPA and its authority are the bright, shiny object, but it's also important that we continue to address and move forward many of the initiatives that we already started in the first term, from energy efficiency standards at DOE to the work that the Department of Interior is doing to site renewables on federal lands, to the aggressive R&D agenda that the Department of Energy is pursuing. I think the last thing I'll mention is this administration as a whole has demonstrated time and time again our ability to think creatively about our existing authorities and use them. And we've done very big, bold things with the Clean Air Act. And things that I think a lot of people didn't even know would be possible. The car rule, doubling efficiency by 2025. The mercury standard for the first ever. We now have a mercury standard for our coal plants, and these were done after literally decades of inaction in the face of a lot of naysayers, but we did get it done, and I'm really confident that those actions and activities are going to provide a strong foundation as we look towards the future.
I promised Lisa right up here, second row in the front, there. And then I'll spread out. Thank you, very helpful.
Lisa Buffani with the law firm Van Ness Feldman. Wanted to ask, when and how will the Keystone decision, including the draft EIS, move forward? And has there been any discussion of perhaps requiring some sort of emission reduction actions by the Canadians on their oil sand production?
The second most popular question I get asked. The answer to that is that the State Department has a process underway that they're working on to develop a supplemental draft EIS. I expect that that will be out at some point in the not too distant future, and the State Department will drive a decision around that draft EIS. It will be an open and transparent process that involves public comment, as all these processes do, which is incredibly important. And beyond that, I would direct your questions to the State Department.
So is it safe to say, because it seemed like the last go-round that it was the State Department's purview, then it was pulled back to the White House and the President was going to make the decision. So was that a misinterpretation?
I mean, there was a little thing called Congress that intervened and made it a little bit more complicated, but the reality is that it's the State Department, and they will pursue the process under the executive order to make a determination, a national interest determination.
Fair enough. Okay. You can go around this side, second row.
Leonard Wayne, a physicist. I don't have any affiliation. You guys are doing wonderful work on climate change. However, I think you just said something that violates the laws of physics. I will listen carefully to the tape and send you an email. You made it sound like we don't necessarily have to accept the fact that from now on, storms and droughts and whatnot are the new normal. But basic physics says that global weirding, as you might call it, there's no way around it, even if we cut emissions to zero, that the climate has basically been in one state from the time of the first pharaoh till now, but it's simply gone, even if we cut emissions to zero. But I'll listen to it carefully and send you an email.
Okay, fair. And I'm not a physicist, so maybe I did. attempting to make there was that, as we are looking at the growing body of scientific evidence, as the federal government continues to do its work, whether that's NOAA and the reports they're putting out, the EPA work around adaptation, the draft national climate assessment that's out and is currently in a public comment process. I think the basic bottom line is that the science compels us to act, and that's what the administration plans to do.
Okay, I thought we had a question over the side here. Go ahead.
I appreciate your comments. My name is Dennis Miller. I'm with the Salina Fuels Corporation. I find it ironic that the ETS was passed in the European Union to control emissions and lower the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere by restricting emissions from land vehicles, ships, and aircraft. And because of that, we've been asked to build plants in Europe to produce biofuels that will, in fact, not have any sulfur emissions, no particulate matter emissions, and will have very, very low greenhouse gas and, of course, carbon dioxide emissions. Now we've run into a situation where the European Union has been sued by the aircraft industry in the United States, and of course Congress passed a law and the President signed it saying that the European Union can't impose this ETS on American companies. So the ironic part is that we're still doing a lot of business in Europe because the European airline companies and ship companies need this kind of fuel. But in the United States, there's nothing comparable that will allow the same kind of work to be done here. So I'd just like to know what your comments are on that.
Certainly, and thank you for your comments. As our administration thinks about the opportunities around biofuels, I think we are incredibly excited that for the first time ever, advanced biofuels are creating and providing real barrels. It has been a long slog. I think there have been a lot of questions from Congress about some of the requirements of the Renewable Fuel Standard, and maybe we were talking about whether or not the regulatory environment is perfectly matched to the realities we see today. I think this is certainly one area, but we continue to see, and I think this administration continues to invest both in the research and development. The EPA just last week put out another pathways rule. We're continuing to really make a lot of progress towards bringing advanced biofuels into our domestic supply portfolio, and really, we'll continue to work on that. I mean, we spent a lot of time with Congress on some of the work that we're trying to do through the Defense Department to bring biofuels forward there, and we need to talk about an ironic situation. I mean, the notion that you've got a Defense Department that wants to make some investments in biofuels because they see it as an imperative from the energy security perspective, but you have a lot of members of Congress who are trying to block the Defense Department from doing that. So I think we certainly see biofuels as an area of opportunity, and we're going to continue to make sure that as where we have regulatory opportunities, where we have opportunities in the budget, we continue to pursue those.
So when the administration came in 2009, there was clear-cut climate and energy goals, right? There was the transformation agenda. Copenhagen was coming soon.
Right.
We were still working off the notion of resource scarcity. There's been some people that argued with this newfound resource wealth that we ought to go with an industrial policy, and I give you all credit for what I would call the evolution over 4 years as the landscape changed. Is it safe to say that even though there's a climate objective, there's an economic objective, and you still have a foreign policy security objective, that the policy is still kind of evolving in part in reaction to facts on the ground, but in part in reaction to things that you need to accomplish? I mean, it's somewhat fluid. It's not
Yeah.
set in stone at this point.
I think that's absolutely true, and you know, from our perspective, it is a little bit fluid, but you know, the landscape is changing. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking, you know, to the rail industry, for example, who is trying to get its head around, you know, what are the right opportunities to deal with, what's the right infrastructure to deal with all the oil that is currently in the mid-continent. And, you know, us deciding today exactly what the right infrastructure is when it's an ever-changing, when the facts on the ground are changing so quickly, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think we're trying to remain fluid, but also sort of keep some guideposts out there around, you know, safe and responsible production, around continuing to invest in research and development, and sort of overlaying that with broader climate objectives. And while it probably might not look perfectly pretty from the outside, I think that those goalposts have really helped this administration deliver on an energy policy that makes a lot of sense and has provided a lot of benefits to this country.
It's hard to imagine in this climate that if you do anything other than be flexible and adaptive, it's hard to see how you get it right. We're going to take two questions and then we'll try to combine them and then ask Heather to answer. So we'll take one here. And sir, we'll keep it in front of you.
Hi, I'm Ed Felker with Energy Guardian. The administration is really being challenged by some of the environmental groups to look at production of oil as a contributor to climate change. Mm-hmm. Are you ready to accept that argument that the production side is important, or is it merely the consumption side that this administration wants to get at?
I think a couple things. First, I don't want people to walk out of this room and think that there's a big game of gotcha happening here, because there's not. I think when we talk about the need to continue safe and responsible domestic oil and gas production, that's done because we recognize that in the near term, we need those resources, but we also know that can't come at the expense of public health and the environment. And I don't think industry would disagree with that. At the same time, you know, I think, you know, we absolutely need to look at, you know, what are the emissions associated with production. And, you know, as I said in response to a previous question, you know, the broader goal of a 17% emissions reduction target is not something that one tool alone is going to help you achieve. And I think, you know, we are focused on, you know, certainly where do you get the most bang for your buck. I think certainly we are going to have an open mind and look at all tools given the imperative and given the challenge, the size of this challenge.
David, we have one behind you. And then I'll let you go. You can have the last word.
Alan Khatib, petroleum consultant. Just a cautionary note about potential crude oil exports from the United States. You know, the International Energy Agency, and their latest, you know, annual study, they projected that the U.S. would exceed Saudi Arabian production in the early 20s, but that would last only 1 or 2 years. And they have the U.S. being a net importer of oil, you know, all the way to 2035. And I have a question on the climate change. You know, for the last 2 decades, there have been numerous world conferences, and they haven't achieved very much because the major polluters have not committed themselves to anything. What are the prospects of reaching an agreement with China and India in particular?
Well, I think, you know, the president felt so strongly about the need for the United States to engage in the international dialogue. He flew all the way to Copenhagen in 2009. And I think the outcome of that was, while not perfect, it was historic in nature, and we know that there's a lot of additional work to do. To your point, how do we advance the dialogue with China and India and other emerging economies? I think that is why there's been a focus within the administration to look at, certainly as important as the COP is, what are the other fora through the MEF, et cetera, that we can advance this conversation, and what are some of the, identifying those opportunities. What have we done here in the United States that works, that can be transferred? Where are the key opportunities around research and development? And, ultimately, I think from the administration's perspective, us being able to show real emissions reductions to our friends in the international community puts us on far more credible footing. And so we sort of, we need to be doing both things, and that's what our administration is focused on.
David, go ahead. Sure. Thanks.
Hi, I'm David Bardeen, retired member of Aaron Fox Law Firm and other things. I've got two questions about presidential power and creativity related to the 3 points in your opening presentation. Frank asked you about exports. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's a economic dimension to exports, but I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking about the second point, national security. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure that you and your colleagues are tasking the departments to make sure for the president, as commander-in-chief, that for all of the categories of emergencies that you can conceive of, that he has the powers to act in an emergency to deal with export needs for ourselves and our allies. And if he doesn't, that he figures out what's the gap and how to deal with it. So that was my first question. And I hope the answer is yes in any event. I think it kind of suggests that. The second has to do with your third point, climate change, and its relationship to tax reform. It happens this morning we had a webcast by another great think tank, Resources for the Future, devoted, an all-star cast, devoted to that correlation. I think you and your colleagues will find all of the material very interesting. But my question to you is, are you and your colleagues putting together for our president as good a synthesis, if that's the right word, but discussion of how to fit together the tax reform objectives, which are going to be on the plate, higher and lower, but over the months ahead, the climate change objectives, how can they support each other, where do they compete with each other, how can we deal smartly and intelligently with those issues? And I'd just like to give you a list of the people who spoke at today's things that you can, your leisure, look at the people who are in the webcast.
Do you have phone numbers, David?
They're available.
No.
Well, David, thank you for your points. On the first one, I think, the short answer is yes, but it also is worth noting that we can't underscore how our changing domestic energy portfolio is impacting how we think about energy security and the international components. And so that is certainly something that, my colleagues within the White House and across the administration are working on. On the tax reform point, I think a couple things. One, we certainly see huge opportunity to tackle a number of challenges on the economic and climate front through our tax policy. And I would hope, and I think you'll continue to hear from the president, that we would hope to be in a position where we can have a dialogue with Congress about true tax reform. I would also say that I appreciate these names, and the way I do business, and I've met with many of the people in this room, is that I'll profess to not have all the answers. And we do better as an administration when we have a stronger working relationship and we're building on the best and brightest minds, whether that's in this city or out outside the Beltway. And yeah, I think we have made a real concerted effort at an open door policy, and certainly appreciate additional input, and we'll follow up with these folks.
So we're going to draw this to a close, but let me thank you all for your patience and attention. And Heather, this has just been extraordinary. Very much appreciate you coming here.
No problem.
You'll have to come back, because I'm sure we'll have other questions. Thank you.